The wind was a blade against Lila's skin. It sliced through the heavy wool of the cloak she had stolen and bit at the thin cambric of the bridal underdress beneath. A garment of lace and promises that felt like a shroud. Each gust was a raw, physical thing, trying to tear her from the saddle of the panicked mare she rode. Thorns, unseen in the moonless dark, ripped at the cloak and her legs, leaving behind fiery trails of pain she barely registered. All that mattered was the forward motion, the desperate, lung-burning gallop away from the house, away from the room with the velvet curtains and the man whose breath smelled of stale cigars and ownership. Her world had shrunk to the straining muscles of the horse between her knees, the wild sting of tears freezing on her cheeks, and the thunder of hooves against the hard, unforgiving ground. She had not planned this. There had been no plan, only a sudden, suffocating certainty that if she walked down that aisle in the morning, the person she was, the small, quiet flame of herself, would be extinguished forever. So she had run, slipped out a side door while the house slept, saddled the first horse she could gentle in the stables, and fled into the teeth of the Wyoming night. She rode east, toward the jagged spine of the mountains that clawed at the bruised purple sky. There was a story her younger brother used to tell, a whisper of a place beyond the reach of their father's lands, a line shack or an old trapper's cabin, abandoned for years, a place no one ever went. It was less than a destination. It was a prayer, a fool's hope, and it was all she had. Then the sky, which had been merely threatening, tore open. The rain did not fall. It hammered down in sheets of glacial cold, turning the ground to a slick, treacherous mud. The wind became a physical wall, and the mare, already exhausted, stumbled and screamed a sound of pure terror as a fork of lightning split the heavens, illuminating a world of skeletal trees and churning chaos. Lila clung to its neck, her knuckles white, whispering nonsensical reassurances that were swallowed by the storm. They blundered on through the maelstrom, directionless now, driven by sheer instinct. Lila's body, already running on the last dregs of adrenaline, began to fail. A bone-deep cold settled into her marrow, and her shivering became so violent she could barely hold the reins. The mare, frantic and blind, caught its leg in a washout. It went down with a sickening lurch, throwing Lila clear into a thicket of rain-lashed sagebrush. Pain, sharp and blinding, shot up her leg. The horse scrambled to its feet, wild-eyed and lame, and bolted into the darkness, its whinny a fading cry of despair. Lila was alone. She tried to stand, but her ankle gave way, sending a fresh wave of agony through her. She crawled, dragging the useless limb through the mud and debris, the fine lace of her underdress tearing, packing with grit and filth. The hope of the cabin was a distant, mocking echo. There was only the cold, the pain, and the roaring dark. She saw a shape ahead, a block of deeper black against the gray sheeting rain. A structure. It was low and rough, barely more than a lean-to against a rock face. With the last of her strength, she pulled herself toward it, her fingers raw, her body a single, screaming nerve of cold. She made it under the flimsy overhang of a stable roof, the smell of hay and animal sweat a faint, earthy comfort. And then the world dissolved into a silent, bottomless black. Cole sat at his rough-hewn table, the cabin's single room lit by the unsteady dance of a dwindling fire. A half-empty bottle of whiskey stood at his elbow, a familiar companion in his self-imposed exile. The storm was a good one, a real Wyoming blow that rattled the window panes and moaned in the chimney like a dying man. It suited his mood. The noise of the wind and rain helped drown out the other sounds, the ones that lived inside his head. The crack of a rifle, the scream of a woman, the silence that came after. Ghosts from the war. Ghosts from the years that followed. They were always there, but they were louder on nights like this, when the world outside was as dark as his own memory. He took a slow swallow of the whiskey, letting the burn slide down his throat. It was a dull-edged lie, a warmth that promised comfort but delivered only numbness. He had come here, to this isolated patch of nowhere, to be left alone. The nearby town of Redemption wanted nothing to do with him, and the feeling was mutual. They saw a pariah, a man whose past was a stain that could not be washed away. He saw a town of hypocrites who slept soundly on beds of convenient forgetting. Here, with his handful of horses in the vast, unforgiving silence, there were no lies. It was then he heard it, a sound that cut through the symphony of the storm. It was faint, almost lost in the wind, but it was there, a horse's whimper, high-pitched and distressed. Not his own stock. They were secure in the small, sturdy barn he had built. This was something else. Cole was not a man given to curiosity, and trouble had a way of finding those who went looking for it. He stayed seated, telling himself it was the wind, a trick of the ear. But the sound came again, closer this time, followed by a soft, heavy thud. With a curse, he pushed himself to his feet. Duty was a hard habit to break. He grabbed his oilskin coat from a peg by the door and a lantern, shielding the flame with his hand as he stepped out into the tempest. The wind tore at him, trying to rip the coat from his back. He leaned into it, his boots sinking into the mud as he made his way toward the small, three-sided stable where he kept his hay. The whimper he'd heard was gone, but his horse, a steady buckskin gelding, was shifting nervously in its stall in the main barn. Its ears pricked toward the lean-to. Cole raised the lantern. The light slid over wet hay, a discarded saddle blanket, and then something else, a heap of sodden wool and mud, from which a pale, slender hand emerged, fingers curled loosely against the dirt floor. He moved closer, his jaw tight. It was a woman, or what was left of one. Her cloak was torn to ribbons, and beneath it, he could see the impossible white of a lace-trimmed garment, stained with blood and grime. Her hair, a dark river of silk, was matted with leaves and mud. A nasty gash on her temple oozed blood, and her face was a ghostly white, tinged with blue at the lips. He knelt, his fingers pressing against the side of her neck. For a long second, there was nothing. Then, a pulse, faint and thready as a spider's web, alive, just a storm of conflicting impulses warred within him. Leave her. It was not his business. Taking her in meant inviting a world of trouble he had spent years avoiding. But the image of a body he had once found lying in the dust, a small child he had been too late to save, flashed behind his eyes. He could not leave her. He could not be too late again. With a grunt, he slid his arms beneath her, one under her knees, the other supporting her back. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight of chilled bone and wet fabric. As he lifted her, her head lolled back, and the lantern light caught the dark, ugly bruising that circled her wrist like a manacle. He carried her out of the stable and back through the raging storm to the cabin. Kicking the door shut behind him, he laid her gently on the cot that served as his bed, the only soft surface in the entire place. For a moment, he just stood there, dripping rainwater onto the floorboards, looking down at the wreckage of a person that had washed up at his door. She was a question he did not want to answer, a story he did not want to hear. Working with a detached efficiency he had learned in the army, he began to tend to her. He fetched the basin, filled it with warm water from the kettle by the fire, and found a clean rag. He carefully wiped the mud and blood from her face, revealing delicate features pinched with pain and exhaustion. He cleaned the gash on her temple, his touch surprisingly gentle, and examined her ankle. It was swollen and likely sprained, but not broken. As he worked, he saw more. The faint, yellowing shadow of a bruise high on her cheekbone, another dark mark on her collarbone, peeking from the collar of her strange, flimsy dress. These were not the marks of a simple fall from a horse. He knew he had to get her out of the wet clothes, but he hesitated. It felt like a violation, another trespass against someone who had already suffered too much. But to leave her in them was to invite a fever that would surely kill her. Steeling himself, he unfastened the sodden cloak and pulled it away. The garment underneath was absurdly out of place in his rough cabin, a confection of fine cotton and lace, now ruined. He worked the tiny buttons with his calloused fingers, keeping his eyes averted as much as possible, focusing on the task. Once she was free of the wet layers, he covered her immediately with his thickest wool blanket. Tucking it tightly around her shivering form, he built up the fire until it roared in the hearth, casting flickering shadows that made the small room seem both smaller and more isolated from the world. He sat back down at the table, the whiskey bottle forgotten, and waited. The silence of the room a stark contrast to the howling chaos outside. Lila awoke to the feeling of warmth, a sensation so foreign and profound it felt like a dream. The shivering had stopped. The biting cold was gone, replaced by a heavy, enveloping heat. She was lying on something soft, covered by a weight of wool that smelled of wood smoke and man. Her eyes fluttered open. The world was a blur of orange and shadow, a low ceiling of rough-hewn logs, a stone fireplace where flames leaped and crackled. She was inside, safe. Then a shape moved in the corner of her eye. A man, sitting at a table, his back to her. A broad back, clad in a dark, homespun shirt. He was large, still, a silhouette against the fire's glow. And terror, cold and absolute, washed away the warmth. He had found her. Nathaniel had sent him. The thought was a shard of ice in her gut. She had not escaped. She had only delayed the inevitable. Her body, which had been limp with exhaustion, went rigid. A strangled cry escaped her lips as she tried to scramble away, to get off the cot, but her injured ankle protested with a bolt of white-hot pain, and she fell back with a gasp. The man turned his head slowly. In the firelight, his face was all angles and shadows, a harsh landscape of a jawline covered in dark stubble, a straight, uncompromising nose, and eyes that were lost in the darkness of their sockets. He rose from his chair, not quickly, but with a deliberate motion that seemed to her like the movement of a predator. "No," she whispered, her voice a raw croak. She pushed herself up on her elbows, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break through. "Do not touch me. Stay away from me." He stopped, holding his hands up, palms out, in a gesture that was meant to be placating but only heightened her fear. "Easy now," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. "You are safe here."
"Liar,"
she hissed, the word torn from her throat. She looked around wildly for a weapon, anything. Her eyes fixed on a cast-iron poker resting on the hearth. She lunged for it, ignoring the agony in her ankle, and brandished it before her, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold it. "I will not go back. I will die first." The man said nothing. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. He did not move closer. He did not speak again. He just stood there, a silent, looming presence, letting her terror burn itself out. The moment stretched into an eternity. The only sounds were her own ragged breaths, the spit and crackle of the fire, and the relentless howl of the wind outside. Slowly, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a crippling weakness. The heavy poker drooped in her grip. Her eyes, still fixed on him, began to take in the details of the room, the stark simplicity of it, the lack of any finery, the worn leather of his gun belt hanging from a peg on the wall. This was not a place Nathaniel's men would bring her. This was the home of a poor man, a solitary man. She looked back at his face. There was no cruelty in it, no smug satisfaction of a captor. There was only a deep, weary stillness. She sank back onto the cot, the poker clattering to the floor. A dry, racking sob escaped her. Then another, the fear, the pain, The cold, the hopelessness of the last 12 hours crested and broke over her in a devastating wave. She curled into a ball beneath the blanket and wept, not with the soft tears of a lady, but with the gut-wrenching, animal sounds of a soul that had reached its absolute limit. The man, Cole, watched as she broke. He felt a familiar, unwelcome pang of pity. He retreated to the other side of the room, giving her the illusion of space, and busied himself by ladling some of the stew he had made earlier into a bowl. He did not know what to do with a woman's tears. Words of comfort felt like lies on his tongue, so he did the only thing he knew how. He offered sustenance. He placed the bowl of stew on a small crate beside the cot, along with a cup of water and a spoon. He did it all without looking at her directly. Then he picked up his coat. "I will be in the barn with the horses," he said to the wall. "Your clothes are drying by the fire. They are clean enough." He left without another word, closing the door softly behind him, leaving her alone with the warmth and the food and the quiet. When he returned an hour later, the bowl was empty. She was asleep again, her face tear-streaked but peaceful in the firelight. He found the dry clothes he had given her, a spare shirt and a pair of his old, patched wool trousers, folded neatly on the crate. He turned his back to the cot without a second thought, banking the fire for the night. He would sleep in the chair. It was not comfortable, but he had slept in far worse places. Over the next day, a fragile, unspoken truce formed between them. They moved around each other in the confines of the small cabin with a careful, deliberate slowness. Speech was a currency neither of them seemed willing to spend. Instead, they communicated in silent gestures. He would leave food on the table for her. She would wash the bowl and spoon and leave them by the basin. He chopped more wood than was necessary. She took one of his torn shirts and, finding a needle and thread in his meager supply kit, began to mend it with small, precise stitches. A strange tension began to weave itself into the silence. It was not the sharp, jagged tension of fear anymore, but something else, something softer and more dangerous. It was in the way her eyes would follow him as he moved about the cabin, his movements economical and sure. It was in the way he would catch the scent of her, a clean, feminine scent that was entirely alien in his solitary world. They were acutely aware of one another, two solitary planets pulled into a strange, uncomforting orbit. The fire crackled. The storm outside slowly blew itself out, and the silence in the cabin grew heavier, filled with everything they were not saying. Cole watched her when he thought she was not looking. He saw the way she moved, with a guarded grace that was now hampered by her limp. He saw the way her hands, though gentle with the needle, were clenched into fists when she thought herself unobserved. He saw the bruises. The one on her wrist was a dark, angry purple now. He had seen its like before, on men held too tightly by the provost guard. It was the mark of a struggle, of a hand being held down against its will. He saw the way she flinched if he moved too quickly, the way her eyes would dart to the door, a haunted, hunted look that spoke of a constant, grinding fear. He pieced together the story in his mind. The fine, torn underdress, the bruises, the terror, the flight into a deadly storm. She was on the run, running from a man who had put those marks on her, a man she was willing to die in a blizzard to escape. He did not need to ask. He did not want to know the details. Knowing would make it his problem, and he had enough ghosts of his own. Prying would only reopen wounds he could see she was desperately trying to stitch closed. So he kept his silence, and he watched, and a cold, familiar anger began to coil in his gut. Late in the afternoon, the storm finally passed. A watery sunlight broke through the clouds, making the wet world glitter. The silence that fell was different now, clearer, more defined, and into that silence came a new sound. It was distant, carried on the clean, cold air, the rhythmic, muffled beat of horses' hooves, not one horse, but several, moving through the hills to the west. Lila, who was sitting by the fire, went utterly still. her head cocked, the mending forgotten in her lap. Cole, who was sharpening a knife by the window, froze, his hand hovering over the whetstone. Their eyes met across the small room. The unspoken tension, the quiet kindness, the fragile truce, it all vanished, burned away by a single, shared understanding. Trouble was coming. The riders passed. Cole had watched them from the window. A dark knot of men moving with purpose against the washed-out landscape, their forms eventually swallowed by the distant hills. They had not stopped. He said nothing, and Lila asked nothing. But the passing of the threat did not bring relief. It left behind a different kind of quiet, a silence that was heavier than the storm's fury. It was a breathing silence, filled with the knowledge of what lay outside the cabin's flimsy walls, and the even more complicated territory of what lay between the two of them. The next morning, the world was scrubbed clean. Sunlight, thin and pale, slanted through the single window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The sky was a vast, aching blue. With the light came a subtle shift in their dynamic. Lila, though still limping, began to move about the cabin with a quiet purpose. She was no longer just a patient, a piece of flotsam washed ashore. She found the coffee pot, ground the last of his beans with a stone, and set it to boil over the fire, filling the small space with a rich, dark aroma that seemed to chase away the last of the night's ghosts. She found his mending kit again and went through his meager collection of clothes, her needle moving with a steady, rhythmic grace. She was reclaiming a piece of herself through these small, domestic acts. It was a language of normalcy in a world that had become unhinged. There was only one thing she steadfastly avoided. She never once glanced at the small, cracked piece of looking-glass he kept by the basin for shaving. She washed her face. She tied back her hair with a piece of twine, but she did not look at her own reflection, to see the face of the bride. The girl who had failed to be brave until it was almost too late was a penance she could not bear. Cole watched her, a storm of his own brewing beneath his calm exterior. He watched the way the firelight caught the deep brown of her hair, the efficient grace of her hands as she stitched a seam, the unconscious dip of her head as she concentrated. Each movement was a small, sharp ache in his chest. He had lived in a world of harsh lines and brutal necessities for so long that he had forgotten the softness a woman's presence could bring to a room, and it terrified him. The scent of the boiling coffee snagged on a wire in his memory, pulling him back to a time when the world was green, before it had all turned to dust and blood. He was a boy then, barely 20, a scout for a Union column moving through Missouri. The air had smelled of chicory coffee and dew-wet grass. He had been proud, cocky even, good with a horse and a rifle, sure of the rightness of his cause. He had trusted a man, a local farmer named Abel, who swore allegiance to the Union and offered information on a rebel supply train. Cole, full of youthful certainty, had vouched for him. He had led a small patrol, not of soldiers, but of the column's civilian guards, older men to the spot Abel had indicated. But there was no supply train. It was a trap, not for the soldiers, but for a small, isolated homestead of German immigrants, the Schmidts, who had sold food to the Union Army. Abel's loyalty was to his secessionist neighbors, not to the flag. The memory came in flashes of gunpowder and sunlight. The surprised look on Mr. Schmidt's face as he came out of his barn, the way Mrs. Schmidt fell in her vegetable garden, a basket of beans spilling around her, and the child, a little girl with hair the color of corn silk, clutching a doll made from a husk. She had just stood there, staring at him, her blue eyes wide with a question he could never answer. He had been shot in the ensuing firefight, a clean wound through the shoulder, but the other wound, the one that never healed, was the image of that girl's face as the raiders set fire to her home. The town, which had lost sons to the information Cole had passed on, needed someone to blame. The army needed a scapegoat. Cole, the scout who had been duped, became the pariah. They didn't call him a fool. They called him a traitor, a murderer. The name had stuck. He shook his head, the memory receding, leaving its bitter taste in his mouth. He looked at Lila, her head still bowed over her sewing. He was a man who brought death. He had no right to the warmth she brought into his home, no right to the dangerous, unfamiliar feeling that was beginning to curl in his gut. It was more than just the loneliness of a long time without a woman. It was a sharp, specific wanting, a desire to smooth the worried line between her brows, to see her smile, to hear her speak his name. It was a desire that felt like a betrayal of the dead, a sacrilege he could not afford. Later that day, as she was adding a log to the fire, her hand brushed against the rough mantelpiece and she winced, drawing back. He saw the raw scrape on her knuckles from her crawl through the wilderness. Without a word, he went to his saddlebags and took out a small tin of salve. He walked over to her. She flinched as he approached, her eyes wide and wary, but she did not pull away. "Give me your hand," he said, his voice quiet. She hesitated, then slowly extended her hand. He took it gently. Her skin was soft, despite the calluses beginning to form. He opened the tin and scooped out a small amount of the greasy ointment, carefully rubbing it into the broken skin. His touch was impersonal, methodical, but the simple contact of his thumb stroking her skin sent a jolt through them both. He could feel the fine tremor in her fingers. She could feel the rough warmth of his calloused skin against hers. The air in the cabin grew thick, charged with the unspoken. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He nodded, releasing her hand and stepping back, putting a necessary distance between them. "You need supplies, food, something for that ankle." "I have no money," she said, her gaze falling to the floor. "I did not ask if you had money." The conversation hung there, an admission that their fates were, for now, intertwined. Later, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of bruised orange and purple, she finally spoke the words that had been poisoning the silence between them. "His name is Nathaniel Crown," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. Cole stopped what he was doing, turning to face her fully. "He owns most of the valley 2 days' ride south of here. My father owns the parcel of land next to his, the one with the only year-round river access." She paused, taking a steadying breath. "My brother, Thomas, he ran up a debt with Mr. Crown, a cattle deal that went bad. When Thomas could not pay, Mr. Crown's men paid him a visit. They broke his spine. He will never walk again." Her voice cracked on the last words, and she pressed her lips together into a thin white line. "The wedding," she continued, her eyes fixed on a point on the far wall, "was the payment for the debt. My father's land, secured through marriage to me, a union of property. Mr. Crown is more than twice my age. He made it clear what my duties would be, and what would happen to Thomas if I failed in them." Cole's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He thought of the bruises on her wrist, on her face. A cold, clean rage settled over him. It was a familiar feeling, one of the few he allowed himself. "The law," he said, his voice a low growl. "The sheriff." Lila gave a short, bitter laugh that was more like a sob. "The law? Cole, the wedding was to be a grand affair. The guest list was very impressive. Judge Thompson was there, to witness the signing of the deeds. Sheriff Brody was there, to provide security and share a bottle of Mr. Crown's finest brandy. And my father was there to give me away." The hope he had not even realized he was holding, a faint, foolish glimmer that there might be a place for her to go, a person to appeal to, curdled in his gut. He saw it then, the perfect, brutal construction of the cage she had been in, the law, the community, her own family. They were not just complicit, they were the bars of the trap. There was no safe place for her. The world was her enemy. The next day, he saddled his buckskin and a quiet sorrel mare. They had to go to town. Their supplies were nearly gone, and her ankle needed a proper bandage. The town of Redemption was a 10-mile ride, a collection of false-fronted buildings huddled in a dusty valley, clinging to a name it had never earned. The ride was mostly silent. The landscape was beautiful in its stark, unforgiving way, but neither of them saw it. Lila was lost in her own fears, and Cole was on high alert, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines. When they reached the edge of town, he turned to her. "Stay close. Do not speak to anyone unless you have to. Let me do the talking." She nodded, her face pale. As they rode down the main street, it was as if a ripple of poison spread out before them. Doors that had been open were quietly closed. Conversations that had been lively dwindled to whispers. Women pulled their children closer, their faces pinched with disapproval. They stared at Lila, their eyes raking over her patched, ill-fitting men's clothes, her unbound hair. They saw a fallen woman, a sinner. Then their gaze would shift to Cole, and the disapproval would curdle into something uglier, a mixture of fear and contempt. Men standing outside the saloon stopped talking, their expressions hardening. One of them, a lanky man with a mean-looking mouth, spat a stream of tobacco juice that landed in the dust near Cole's horse. "Look what the wind blew in," the man drawled, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The murderer of Redemption, back from his exile." Cole's face remained a mask of stone. He stared straight ahead, his hands resting easy on the pommel of his saddle, but Lila could feel the tension radiating from him, a deadly stillness that was more intimidating than any outburst. He dismounted in front of the general store and tied up the horses. "Wait here," he commanded, and went inside. Lila sat on the mare, feeling the weight of 100 hostile eyes on her. She kept her gaze fixed on the worn leather of the saddle horn, trying to will herself invisible. The man who had spoken, Elias, swaggered over, his friends snickering behind him. "Well now," Elias said, looking her up and down in a way that made her skin crawl. "That is a fine-looking piece for a man like Cole. Did you run away from a convent, or did he just pull you out of a ditch?" Lila's face burned with humiliation, but she remembered Cole's warning and said nothing. Her silence seemed to amuse him. "Cat got your tongue, or maybe you are just saving it for him. They say he likes them quiet, like the dead." Before he could say more, the store door swung open and Cole stepped out, a sack of supplies slung over his shoulder. He took in the scene in a single, cold glance. He did not raise his voice. He did not draw his weapon. He simply looked at Elias, and in his eyes was a look of such profound and lethal emptiness that Elias's smirk faltered. He took an involuntary step back. "Get away from my horse, Elias," Cole said, his voice flat and cold as a river stone. Elias, bolstered by his audience, tried to recover his swagger. "Just admiring the livestock." Cole dropped the sack of supplies by the horses and took a slow step toward him. "You have admired enough." For a tense moment, no one moved. The entire street seemed to be holding its breath. Then, Elias, seeing something in Cole's eyes that he did not want to test, shrugged and turned away, muttering a curse under his breath. Cole watched him go before turning back to the horses, his expression unchanged. He helped Lila dismount, and they went into the store to get the bandages. The ride back to the cabin was even quieter than the ride in. The ugliness of the town clung to them like the dust on their clothes. They had not found supplies so much as they had survived an attack. That night, the tension that had been simmering between them finally reached its boiling point. The cabin felt smaller than ever, the air thick with unspoken fear, the lingering sting of humiliation, and a raw, aching need that neither of them was willing to name. Cole was cleaning his rifle, his movements precise and controlled. Lila was sitting on the cot, staring into the fire, her arms wrapped around herself as if to keep from flying apart. He had finished his task and was putting the rifle away when she made a small, wounded sound. He turned. A single tear was tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. He did not know what to do, what to say. All the words he knew were for horses and cattle, for commands and curses. He had no language for this. He walked over and knelt in front of her. "What is it?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "I am so afraid," she whispered, her voice breaking. "And I am so tired of being afraid." Without thinking, he reached out and brushed the tear from her cheek with his thumb. The contact was electric. Her skin was impossibly soft. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut, a shudder passing through her. And in that moment, the careful walls they had built around themselves crumbled to dust. It was not a gentle impulse. It was a collision of fear and grief, and a desperate soul-deep hunger, a hunger for comfort, for warmth, for the simple, human affirmation of another's touch. He saw it in her eyes, a mirror of the same wild wanting that was clawing its way up his own throat. He leaned in, his gaze dropping to her lips, parted and trembling. She lifted her chin, a silent, desperate invitation. Their faces were inches apart, their breaths mingling in the charged air. He could feel the heat of her skin, smell the faint, clean scent of her hair. But just as their lips were about to meet, she gasped and pulled back, her eyes flying open, wide with a fresh wave of horror. "No," she whispered, scrambling away from him to the far side of the cot. "I cannot." She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with violent sobs. A fresh wave of shame, so powerful it buckled her knees, washed over her. What was she doing? How could she want this? To want the touch of a man, any man. After what she had fled, she felt sullied, weak, a broken thing who craved the very thing that had been her cage. She was ashamed of her fear, but she was even more ashamed of her need. Cole remained kneeling on the floor, his hand still held in the air where it had touched her face. He felt as if he had been struck. He said nothing. He watched her cry, a silent, unmoving sentinel of her grief. Then, slowly, he got to his feet. He picked up his coat from the peg by the door. He did not look at her. He simply walked outside, closing the door behind him, and did not come back. He spent the entire night outside in the freezing dark, leaning against the rough wood of the barn, the cold a welcome punishment that helped to deaden the turmoil inside him. The first light of dawn was a hesitant gray, seeping through the cabin's single window and painting the floor in shades of ash. Lila awoke with a start, a familiar knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. The cabin was cold, the fire nothing but a bed of glowing embers, and it was empty. The chair where Cole had slept the night before was vacant. She sat up, the thick wool blanket pooling around her waist, and listened. The only sound was the faint whisper of the wind in the pines. A wave of guilt, sharp and sickening, washed over her. She had pushed him away, repaid his kindness with her own brokenness, and he had left. The thought was unbearable. She pictured him riding away, leaving her to her fate, and a panic more profound than any she had yet felt began to rise in her throat. She dressed quickly, her hands fumbling with the buttons on the unfamiliar shirt, her injured ankle throbbing a dull, rhythmic protest. She had to know. She stepped outside into the biting morning air. The world was still and pristine, the ground hardened by a night frost. She looked toward the small corral, her heart sinking. His buckskin was there, as was the sorrel mare, but he was nowhere in sight. Then she saw it, the barn door, slightly ajar. She limped toward it, her breath pluming in the cold. The barn was dark and smelled of hay and horse and cold leather. As her eyes adjusted to the gloom, she saw him. He was not gone. He was sitting on an overturned bucket in the corner of an empty stall, leaning back against the rough-hewn planks, his coat pulled tight around him. His head was slumped forward onto his chest, and a rifle lay across his lap. He was asleep, but it was not the sleep of the peaceful. It was the rigid, exhausted sleep of a sentry who had refused to leave his post. A man who had chosen the freezing misery of the barn over the suffocating tension of the cabin. Her heart ached. The guilt from the night before returned, but now it was tempered with a powerful surge of something else, something tender and fiercely protective. He had stayed. He had kept his silent, solitary vigil, guarding her from threats both real and imagined, even from himself. Quietly, she slipped the shawl from her own shoulders. It was a simple thing of gray wool, one of the few possessions she had managed to grab in her flight. It still held the faint warmth of her body. Moving with a slowness she prayed would not disturb him. She approached his sleeping form. He did not stir. His face, in the dim light, was etched with lines of weariness that went deeper than a single sleepless night. They were lines carved by years of hardship, of sorrows held too close for too long. She gently draped the shawl over his shoulders, tucking it around his neck. The gesture felt both inadequate and profoundly intimate. She let her fingers linger for a second on the rough wool of his coat. A silent apology, a silent thank you. And then she retreated as quietly as she had come, leaving him to his watchman's sleep. Back in the cabin, she built up the fire and put the coffee on to boil. The simple domestic act a balm to her troubled spirit. When he finally came inside an hour later, the sun now fully risen, he wore the shawl. He did not mention it, and neither did she, but it hung between them, a silent acknowledgement of the line that had been crossed and the fragile bridge that was being built in its place. He simply took the cup of coffee she offered, his eyes meeting hers for a brief, unreadable moment, and a new, more settled quiet fell between them. But the world outside their small sanctuary was not quiet. In the town of Redemption, whispers had a way of growing into damning pronouncements. The sight of the disgraced Cole arriving with a mysterious, beautiful woman dressed in rags had been too potent a piece of gossip to remain contained. It twisted and grew with each telling. She was a saloon girl he had run off with. She was a thief. She was a woman of low morals, a fitting companion for a man like him. Elias, the man who had confronted them, made sure to spread the story with particular relish. The rumors traveled on the wind, carried by trappers and circuit riders, until they reached the ears of those who were listening for them. In his grand house in the valley to the south, Nathaniel Crown heard the news. A runaway bride, a disgraced cowboy, a remote homestead east of the mountains. It was enough. He was a man of immense pride and little patience. His property had been stolen, and his authority had been challenged. He would not stand for it. He sent riders to every town, every saloon, every marshal's office within 100 miles. A bounty, $500 in gold for the return of the woman known as Lila, his legal, wedded wife, and a special, private instruction for the men he trusted most. The cowboy she was with was to be made an example of. They did not know this, of course. Their world for the next few days was the small circle of the homestead. Cole worked from sunup to sundown, reinforcing the corral, chopping a mountain of firewood. His movements, driven by a restless, contained energy. Lila took over the care of the cabin, cooking their meager meals, mending, her limp slowly improving. They spoke little, but they moved together in a rhythm born of shared space and unspoken understanding. The memory of that charged moment, of the near kiss, was a constant presence, a live wire running just beneath the surface of their quiet routine. It was late one afternoon when the stranger appeared. He came on foot from the north, a long, lanky man with a scruffy beard and a pack on his back. He carried a rifle in the crook of his arm and moved with an easy, rolling gait. He stopped at the edge of the clearing and hailed the cabin. "Hello, the house? Just a traveler passing through, wondering if a man might fill his canteen." Cole, who had been splitting logs, stopped his work. He rested the axe head on the chopping block, his body seemingly relaxed. But Lila, watching from the doorway, saw the way his eyes had gone flat and watchful. "You are a long way from any trail," Cole said, his voice even. Got myself a bit turned around, the man said with a friendly, gap-toothed grin. Chasing a prime beaver pelt, named Silas. I am a trapper. He gestured to the pack on his back, from which the tail of a fox fur protruded. Just looking to get my bearings. Maybe trade for a bit of salt, if you have any to spare. On the surface, it was all perfectly plausible. But Cole saw things that a trapper would not. The man's boots were worn, but they were cavalry boots, not the soft moccasins or worn-out work boots a trapper would favor. The rifle he carried was a brand-new Spencer repeater, a weapon far too expensive for a man scratching out a living in the mountains. And most of all, Cole saw the way the man's eyes kept darting toward the cabin, a quick, assessing glance that tried to peer past Lila into the shadows behind her. He was not looking at the lay of the land. He was casing the homestead. We have no salt to trade, Cole said, his voice cold. There is a creek a half-mile east. You can get your water there. It was a clear dismissal. But Silas did not move. His friendly grin remained, but it did not reach his eyes. Now, that is not very neighborly. A man gets lonely out here. Just thought I might share a bit of news from the world. Heard a real interesting tale down in Redemption, about a runaway bride, pretty as a picture, and a bounty of $500 for her return. As he spoke, his gaze settled on Lila, a greedy, calculating light entering his eyes. He had made his mistake. In that instant, everything moved. Silas, realizing he had given himself away, began to swing his rifle up, but Cole was already in motion. He was not a brawler. He was a soldier. He moved with a brutal, deadly efficiency. He threw the splitting axe. It was not an aimed, spinning throw, but a low, flat heave. The heavy iron head caught Silas in the thigh, not cutting, but striking with the force of a sledgehammer. The man screamed, a sound of shock and agony, and his leg buckled. His rifle shot going wild, splintering the top of the cabin's doorframe. Lila cried out, stumbling back inside. Cole was on him before he could recover. Closing the distance in 3 long strides, Silas, dropping his rifle, clawed at his belt for a knife. Cole kicked it from his hand. The fight was not a duel. It was a desperate, ugly struggle in the dirt. Silas was wiry and strong, driven by greed and pain. He grabbed a rock and swung it, catching Cole on the side of the head. Cole grunted, staggering back, a trickle of blood running down his temple. For a heart-stopping moment, Silas was on top, his hands reaching for Cole's throat. Lila watched from the doorway, her hands pressed to her mouth, a scream trapped in her chest. It was happening again. A man's violence, the grunting animal sounds of a struggle for dominance. But this was different. This violence was a shield, a wall of brutal protection thrown up around her. Cole, dazed but not defeated, got his legs under him and heaved, throwing the bounty hunter off. He came up with a knife in his hand, the one he used for skinning game. Silas scrambled backward in the dirt, his eyes wide with a fear that had replaced his earlier greed. "Wait," he gasped. "We can split the money?" Cole did not wait. He lunged forward, and the struggle ended with a low, final gurgle. He stayed there for a long moment, kneeling over the body, his chest heaving, the knife still in his hand. The setting sun cast long, bloody shadows across the clearing. The silence that fell was more profound than any that had come before. It was the silence of death. Cole finally pushed himself to his feet, his face a grim, unreadable mask. He looked at Lila, who was still standing in the doorway, her face as white as bleached bone. The sight of the violence had shaken her to her core. It was a brutal, terrifying thing. But as she looked at the dead man in the dirt, and then at Cole, bleeding and exhausted, a new and terrible understanding dawned. He had not done this because he was a violent man. He had done this because she was there. He had killed a man to protect her. He had risked everything, his life, his soul, for her. That night, they buried the body together, Cole found a shovel, and they took the body deep into the woods, to a place where the ground was soft beneath a stand of aspen trees. He dug the grave, the rhythmic scrape and thud of the shovel the only sound in the deepening twilight. Lila stood watch, holding the lantern. She did not offer to help. She knew this was his burden to carry. But she did not leave. She stayed, her presence a silent testament to their shared fate. They were partners in this now, bound by blood and soil. When the hole was deep enough, they rolled the body in without ceremony and covered it with dirt. They worked in silence, two shadows moving in the flickering lantern light, erasing a man from the world. When they returned to the cabin, the air was different. The last of the barriers between them had been buried with the body in the woods. The shared act of violence and concealment had forged a bond that was deeper than words, more powerful than fear. He cleaned the cut on his head by the firelight, his movements slow and weary. She came and stood before him, taking the wet rag from his hand. Her fingers trembled as she dabbed at the blood, her touch so gentle it was almost unbearable. He looked up at her, and in her eyes, he saw not fear or repulsion, but a raw, aching vulnerability that mirrored his own. The firelight danced on her face, illuminating the tear tracks on her cheeks. She was not crying from fear now. It was something else, a grief for the world as it was, for the ugliness they had been forced to embrace. He reached up and cupped her face in his hand, his thumb stroking her jawline. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, a soft sigh escaping her lips. "Lila," he whispered, his voice hoarse. It was the first time he had said her name. It was all it took, their need, suppressed for days under layers of fear and shame and propriety, finally consumed them. He pulled her down onto his lap, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was not gentle or hesitant. It was a kiss of desperation, of two people clinging to each other in the dark, seeking life in the face of death. She wrapped her arms around his neck, kissing him back with a fierce, starved hunger that matched his own. He lifted her and carried her to the cot, laying her down on the rough blanket. By the flickering light of the fire, they came together, their lovemaking a storm of pent-up longing and tender discovery. It was a frantic, desperate act, a confirmation that they were still alive, that they could still feel something other than pain. But beneath the desperation, there was a current of profound tenderness, a gentle exploration of wounds both seen and unseen. It was a silent conversation of skin and breath, a promise of sanctuary in a world that offered none. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the blanket, the fire burning down to embers. Lila lay with her head on his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of everything that had just passed between them. "I do not want to survive," she whispered into the darkness, her voice so quiet he could barely hear it. "If surviving means I have to go back to being someone's property, I would rather have died in that storm." Cole was silent for a long moment, his hand stroking her hair. He thought of the life he had lived, a life of running from the past, of solitude and ghosts. He had not been property, but he had not been free either. He understood. He tightened his arm around her, pulling her closer. "I am not letting anyone take you," he said, his voice a low, solemn vow in the quiet of the room. Outside, hidden in the deep shadows of the pines at the edge of the clearing, a pair of eyes watched the cabin's window. It was Billy, a local farm boy, barely 17, with a weak chin and an ever-present need for coin. Nathaniel Crown's men had found him in town, plied him with whiskey, and pressed a few silver dollars into his hand. All he had to do was watch the cabin and report back. He had seen the stranger arrive. He had hidden when the fight broke out, his heart hammering in his chest, and now he had seen the two figures in the window, wrapped in the firelight, their silhouettes merging into one. He had seen enough. He slipped away as silently as he had come, a ghost in the night, carrying his lucrative secret back to the men who were paying for it. The next morning, Lila awoke first. She felt a sense of peace she had not known in years, a quiet warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She was safe. She was not alone. She slipped out of the cot, careful not to wake Cole, and pulled on her clothes. She wanted to make coffee, to start the day with a small act of normalcy, of home. She opened the cabin door and stepped out into the crisp morning air. And then she saw it, and she screamed. It was his horse, the steady buckskin gelding, his companion in solitude for years. It was dead, but it was more than dead. Its body had been gutted and grotesquely nailed to the barn door, a horrific, bloody tableau against the weathered wood. It was not an act of random cruelty. It was a message, delivered in the night, signed in blood. A message of absolute power, of ruthless ownership, a promise of the horrors yet to come, the peace of the morning, the fragile sanctuary of the night, was shattered into a million pieces. The night's threat had arrived. The scream tore Cole from the depths of sleep. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated horror, a razor blade against the quiet fabric of the morning. He was on his feet before he was fully awake, his hand grabbing the Colt from the holster hanging on the bedpost, his body moving with the grim, ingrained instinct of a man for whom violence was a second language. He met her in the doorway as she stumbled back, her face a mask of terror, her hand pointing toward the barn. He saw it in a single, sickening glance. The sight hit him not with a hot surge of rage, but with a cold, hollow certainty that felt like a stone dropping into a deep well. His buckskin, his partner for 6 years, a creature of quiet strength and unwavering loyalty. The horse had carried him away from the war, had stood with him through blizzards and lonely nights. And now it was a grotesque monument to Nathaniel Crown's cruelty, a bloody declaration of war nailed to his own barn. Lila was babbling, words tumbling out of her in a stream of panicked incoherence, but he did not hear them. He walked past her, his movements stiff and deliberate. He went to the barn, his eyes fixed on the desecrated body of his friend. He did not look away. He forced himself to see every horrific detail. This was what they were facing. Not a fight for land or money, but a battle against a soullessness that could perform an act like this and call it justice. He took a pry bar from the tack room and, with a grim and methodical precision, began the long, terrible task of taking his horse down. When he was finished, he wrapped the body in a canvas tarp. He said nothing to Lila, who watched from a distance, her arms wrapped around herself, shivering in the morning light. He spent the next 2 hours digging a grave on the hill behind the cabin, a spot that overlooked the valley. When he was done, he led the sorrel mare, the only horse he had left, to the spot and used it to drag the heavy, canvas-wrapped bundle into the earth. He returned to the cabin covered in sweat and dirt, his face carved from granite. The grief was a hard, cold knot in his chest, too deep for tears. Lila had made coffee. She handed him a cup, her hand trembling. "We have to go," he said, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "Now." "Go where?" she asked, her voice a small, frightened thing. "North. There are trails through the mountains that are not on any map. I can get you to the territories. You can find a town, change your name, disappear." She stared at him, her eyes searching his face. "You mean you can get me to the territories?" He did not meet her gaze. He stared into the blackness of his coffee cup. "They want you, but they want me dead. If we split up, I can lead them off. I will double back, make them think we are heading west. It will buy you time, days, maybe a week." The reality of what he was saying settled over her. He was planning to sacrifice himself, to be the bait in a trap, with no intention of escaping it, and he was planning to send her away, alone, back into the wilderness that had almost claimed her once already. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it was as unyielding as the mountains themselves. He looked up, his eyes finally meeting hers. "Lila," You saw what they did to my horse. That was a promise. They will not stop." "I know what they did," she said, her voice gaining strength. "And I will not run. Not again." "This is not running," he argued, his voice rising with a raw, desperate edge. "This is surviving. It is the only way." "No," she repeated, stepping closer to him, her chin lifted in defiance. "The only way is together. I fled my father's house in the dark because I was alone. I fled a wedding that was a cage because I was alone. I will not be sent away again. I will not be abandoned. Do you understand me, Cole? I would rather die here, with you, than live out there, alone and afraid." Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. Abandoned. The word hung in the air between them, thick with the weight of her past. He saw the terrified girl who had collapsed in his stable, and he saw the woman standing before him now, her eyes blazing with a fire that matched his own cold rage. She was not a victim to be saved. She was a partner, demanding her right to stand and fight for the life they had just begun to build. He had spent his entire life alone, defined by his failures and his exile. The idea of someone choosing to stand with him, to face certain death rather than leave his side, was a concept so foreign it shook him to his core. He wanted to argue, to force her to see reason, but he saw the unshakable resolve in her eyes. To make her go would be to break the very thing he had come to admire most about her, her spirit. He let out a long, slow breath, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a grim resignation. "All right, Lila," he said, his voice low and heavy. "We stay together." Their decision was tested only hours later. The sun was high in the sky when the smell first reached them, a faint, acrid smell of smoke on the wind, coming from the direction of the creek. Cole was on his feet in an instant, grabbing his rifle. "Stay inside and bar the door," he commanded, his face grim. He moved quickly through the trees, his senses on high alert. The smell grew stronger, thicker, and soon he could hear the hungry crackle of flames. He broke through the last line of pines and stopped dead. The small, brush-covered structure he had built to protect the spring that fed their creek, their only source of fresh water, was engulfed in flames, and the fire was spreading, racing through the dry undergrowth toward the small pasture where the sorrel mare and his 2 milk cows were grazing, trapped against the rock face of the canyon wall. It was sabotage, a deliberate, malevolent act. They had not come for them directly. They were toying with them, dismantling their world piece by piece, forcing them to exhaust themselves, to despair. Cole fired a single shot into the air, a signal to Lila, and then he ran toward the pasture, the fire at his back. Lila, hearing the shot, did not hesitate. She unbarred the door and ran, grabbing 2 empty buckets as she went. When she reached the creek, she saw the scope of the disaster. The fire was moving with terrifying speed, a wall of orange and black smoke. The animals were screaming in terror, rearing and bucking against the flimsy fence of the pasture. They worked with a frantic, desperate synergy, their argument from the morning forgotten, replaced by the single, driving instinct to survive. Cole tore down a section of the fence, trying to herd the panicked animals out of the path of the flames. Lila ran back and forth from the deeper part of the creek, her buckets of water a pitifully small weapon against the raging inferno. She threw the water on the advancing edge of the fire, hissing steam and black smoke rising to meet her, the heat so intense it felt as if it were blistering her skin. Cole managed to get the cows moving, driving them down the creek bed, away from the worst of the danger. But the sorrel mare, wild-eyed with terror, refused to budge. A burning branch fell from a pine tree, landing near her, and she reared, her hooves flailing, and bolted back toward the small, 3-sided feeding shelter at the back of the pasture. The fire was already licking at its dry, timbered roof. "Lila, get back!" Cole yelled, seeing the danger. But Lila saw the mare, trapped and about to be burned alive, and she ran toward her, trying to grab her reins. to lead her to safety. As she reached the shelter, the roof, consumed by flames, began to groan and sag. Cole saw a heavy support beam start to give way, directly above where Lila was standing, her hand outstretched toward the terrified horse. He did not think. He moved. He lunged, tackling her around the waist, pulling her back just as the massive, burning beam crashed to the ground where she had been standing an instant before. The force of his tackle sent them both sprawling. Lila landed hard, but safe. Cole was not so lucky. As he had pushed her clear, his left arm, thrown out to shield his face from the intense heat, had been caught under the edge of the falling beam. He cried out, a sharp, guttural sound of pure agony. Lila scrambled to her feet, her heart seizing with terror. The beam was not fully on him, but it had pinned his forearm to the ground, the heat from the smoldering wood already beginning to char his sleeve. With a surge of adrenaline, she found a long, sturdy branch and, using a rock as a fulcrum, managed to lever the heavy beam up just enough for him to pull his arm free. He staggered to his feet, cradling the injured arm, his face pale and slick with sweat. His forearm was a mess of angry red burns and deep, splintered cuts from the rough wood. They got the mare out, her coat singed but her life spared. And together, they beat back the last of the flames until all that was left was a blackened, smoking scar on the land. Their water source was safe, their livestock saved. But the cost had been high. Back in the cabin, the adrenaline faded, leaving them both shaking and exhausted. Lila gently helped him out of his smoke-stained shirt. The injury was worse than she had thought. The burn was severe, and a long, jagged splinter of wood was embedded deep in the flesh of his forearm. "Hold still," she said, her voice trembling but firm. She took a pair of pliers from his toolkit and sterilized them in the flame of a candle. He sat at the table, his jaw clenched, his eyes squeezed shut as she carefully, painstakingly, pulled the splinter from the wound. He did not make a sound, but she could feel the tremors of pain that racked his body. She cleaned the wound as best she could with whiskey and clean water, then slathered it with the last of their salve and bound it tightly with strips of clean cloth. The work was intimate and agonizing for them both. Her touch was a mixture of clinical necessity and profound tenderness. His silent endurance was a testament to a lifetime of pain. He was weak from the shock and the pain, a fever already beginning to set in. She helped him to the cot and made him lie down. She spent the rest of the day and all through the night at his side, bathing his face with a cool cloth, forcing him to drink water, watching the rise and fall of his chest in the firelight. She did not sleep. She sat in the chair, watching over him, her mind a maelstrom of fear and a fierce, terrifying love. She had almost lost him. The thought was a physical pain, a cold dread that settled deep in her bones. In the space of a few short days, this quiet, broken man had become the center of her world. In the deepest, darkest hours of the night, when the moon was down and the world was utterly still, his fever broke. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He looked at her, his gaze clear for the first time in hours. "You are still here," he whispered, his voice raspy. "I am not leaving," she said softly. She sat on the edge of the cot, taking his uninjured hand in hers. The silence stretched, filled with the intimacy of the sick room, of shared crisis and survival. And in that silence, Lila knew she could not hold her own secret any longer. It was a poison she had to draw out, a truth that had to be spoken between them, no matter the consequences. "Cole," she began, her voice a raw whisper. "There is something else, something you need to know." He waited, his eyes never leaving her face. "When I ran," she said, her gaze dropping to their joined hands, "I was not just running for my life. I was running for two—" She took a shaky breath and forced herself to look at him. "I am pregnant." The words fell into the quiet room with the force of a physical blow. She saw the shock in his eyes, a stunned widening, a flicker of something she could not read. He was silent for a long moment, and in that silence, her heart broke 1,000 times over. She had given him a burden he had not asked for, a complication he could not afford. "Nathaniel's child," he said finally, his voice flat. And here was the final, most terrible part of the truth. "I do not know," she whispered, the words tasting like shame in her mouth. "There was someone else, before, a stable hand. We were careful, but it does not matter. Nathaniel believes it is his. He would claim it as his own, as another piece of his property." She braced herself for the revulsion, for the accusation, for the cold withdrawal she was sure would come. She had offered him a life, and now she was showing him how deeply damaged that life truly was. Cole stared at the log ceiling for a long time, his expression unreadable. She could feel him withdrawing, and a cold despair began to creep over her. But then he turned his head and looked at her. The shock was gone from his eyes, replaced by a quiet, fierce intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. He brought his good hand up and touched her face, his calloused thumb stroking her cheek. "It does not matter," he said, his voice low and certain. "Do you hear me, Lila? It does not matter whose it is. It is yours. That makes it ours, and we will protect it." Tears she had not realized she was holding back began to stream down her face, not tears of fear or grief, but of a relief so profound it felt like a dam breaking inside her. He had not turned away. He had seen the ugliest, most complicated part of her, and he had not flinched. He had claimed her, and the life she carried, as his own. The sun was just beginning to rise when they made their decision. They would not wait for the attack. They would prepare for it. They ate a hurried breakfast, and then, despite the pain in his arm, they began to work. They were a single unit now, forged in fire and blood and truth. They boarded up the single window, leaving only a small slit to see through and fire from. They brought the last of the firewood inside, stacking it against the walls. They filled every bucket and pot with water from the creek. Cole, using his good arm, began to set traps in the woods surrounding the cabin, a deadfall made from a heavy log, a series of tripwires connected to a string of empty tin cans that would serve as an alarm. He showed her the escape route he had scouted years ago. Behind a waterfall in the deepest part of the creek was the mouth of a small cave. It was wet and cold, but it cut through the rock for 50 yards, emerging in a thicket of willows on the other side of the ridge. It was a desperate, last-ditch chance, but it was a chance. As twilight fell, they stood together in the doorway of their fortress, looking out at the world. The cabin was no longer a home. It was a bastion. They were no longer just a man and a woman. They were soldiers, preparing for their last stand. That night, their love deepened into something solid and unbreakable. There was no desperation in their coming together. Only a quiet, profound tenderness, a shared acknowledgement of the precious, fleeting nature of the time they had left. Afterward, as she lay cradled in his good arm, he finally shared the ghost that haunted him most. "The girl," he said, his voice a low murmur against her hair. "The one I could not save. At the Schmidt farm, her name was Anna." He told her everything, about the corn-husk doll she had been holding, about her wide blue eyes, filled not with fear, but with a terrible, silent question, about the sound of her scream as the fire took the house. "I have seen her face every single night for 10 years, he confessed, his voice thick with an ancient grief. "I ran from it. I came here to hide from it, but it was always here, waiting for me in the dark." Lila held him tighter, her heart aching for the young man he had been, for the soldier who had been broken by a world that had no room for saviors. She kissed the scars on his knuckles, the bruised line of his jaw. "You did not fail her, Cole," she whispered. "The world failed her. You were just the one who was forced to watch." They held each other like that through the long, dark hours, two broken people who had somehow, against all odds, found a way to make each other whole. The fire burned low, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the world was quiet, holding its breath. They did not sleep. They waited, listening for the sound of hoofbeats, for the first shouts of the men who were coming to tear their world apart. The dawn was coming, and with it, the riders. They would meet the morning together. The first sound was not the thunder of hoofbeats, but the frantic, tinny rattle of the cans he had strung through the trees. It was a paltry alarm, a child's warning against a monster. But it served its purpose. In the gray, pre-dawn light that filtered through the slit in the window boards, Cole and Lila exchanged a single, final look. There was no fear left in it, only a deep, bone-weary resolve. The time for running, for hiding, for hoping, was over. He checked the load in his rifle, then the Colt at his hip. Lila stood beside him, her hand resting on the small of his back, a silent gesture of solidarity. She held a heavy, cast-iron skillet, a pathetic weapon against the guns that were coming, but her grip was firm, her knuckles white. They waited. The hoofbeats grew louder, a rhythmic, drumming heartbeat of the coming violence. 5 riders emerged from the pines, their forms dark silhouettes against the rising sun. They did not rush the cabin. They reined in at the edge of the clearing, a confident, deliberate display of power. 4 of them were hard-faced men with rifles held ready. The 5th man, sitting astride a magnificent black stallion, was Nathaniel Crown. He was dressed not in buckskin, but in a fine, tailored coat, a man of wealth and influence bringing the city's cold law to the untamed wilderness. Beside him, wearing a tarnished badge on his vest, was Sheriff Brody, his face a mixture of self-importance and unease. "Cole!" Nathaniel's voice boomed across the clearing, a sound of arrogant ownership. "You have made your last mistake, you pathetic recluse. You have harbored stolen property. By the authority of the law, I am here to reclaim what is mine. Send out my wife, and the sheriff here might be inclined to let you live out the rest of your miserable days in a jail cell." The lie was so blatant, so utterly devoid of truth, that Lila almost laughed. His wife, his property. The words were chains, and she could feel them reaching for her even through the thick log walls of the cabin. Cole pushed the barrel of his rifle through the slit in the wall. "She is not your property, Crown, and she is not your wife." Nathaniel did laugh then, a rich, condescending sound that grated on the nerves. "The law says otherwise. A contract was signed, a dowry paid. She belongs to me. Now, send her out before my patience wears thin." Cole's voice was low and steady, a cold counterpoint to Nathaniel's bluster. "If you believe you have a claim, then let it be settled as men. Not with hired guns. Just you and me, a duel. If I win, you ride away and never come back. If you win, you get what you came for." It was a desperate gambit, an appeal to a code of honor that Cole knew in his heart the other man did not possess. Sheriff Brody shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. A duel was a formal, recognized affair. To refuse it was an admission of cowardice, but Nathaniel Crown was not a man constrained by such traditions. He laughed again, louder this time. "A duel? With you, a washed-out, disgraced murderer? Do not be absurd. I do not duel with vermin. I exterminate it." He turned to his men. "Enough of this. Go in there and drag her out. If he resists, shoot him." That was the moment the world broke open. 2 of the men dismounted, their rifles held ready, and started toward the cabin door. The door was barred, but they were carrying heavy axes. "Cole, no," Lila whispered, seeing the suicidal resolve harden in his face. But it was her own scream that ignited the firestorm. As the first axe bit into the wood of the door, a primal, terrified sound was torn from her throat. It was the sound of a cornered animal, the scream of a woman who was about to be dragged back into her cage. For Cole, that sound was the only signal he needed. The world narrowed to a single, explosive purpose. He shoved the rifle through the slit and fired. The first man with the axe stumbled back, a look of pure surprise on his face as a dark stain blossomed on his chest. He fell without a sound, before the second man could even register what had happened. Cole had levered another round into the chamber and fired again. The second man dropped his axe and crumpled to the ground, his hands clutching at his gut. It was a flurry of shocking, deadly violence. The two remaining gunmen and Nathaniel reacted at once. A volley of shots erupting from their rifles. Lead hammered into the cabin's facade, splintering wood, punching holes through the walls. Cole was already moving, pulling back from the window slit as a bullet tore through the space where his head had been. He pushed Lila to the floor, shielding her with his body. "Stay down!" he roared over the deafening gunfire. But in the chaos, as bullets ripped through the small room, a searing, white-hot pain tore through Cole's side. He grunted, the air forced from his lungs, and staggered against the wall. He looked down and saw the dark, wet patch spreading rapidly across his shirt. He had been hit badly. Outside, Sheriff Brody, his courage failing him, began to back his horse away from the cabin. But Nathaniel's third gunman, seeing Cole stagger, saw his chance. He charged the door, kicking it with all his might. The wood, already weakened by the axe blows, splintered and burst inward. The man lunged into the cabin, a big bearded brute with a wild look in his eyes. He saw Lila on the floor and grinned, grabbing her by the arm and hauling her to her feet. "Got her! Mr. Crown!" he yelled. Lila screamed again, but this time it was a scream of pure rage. She twisted in his grip, kicking and scratching. Cole, leaning against the wall, his vision blurring at the edges, tried to raise his Colt, but the man was using Lila as a shield. Then Lila did something none of them could have predicted. With a sudden, vicious twist, she wrenched one of her arms free. In her hair, she still wore the long, sharp steel hat pin that had held her veil in place, a forgotten relic of the wedding she had fled. Her hand flew to her hair, her fingers closing around it. She drove the pin, with all the force of her fear and fury, deep into the soft flesh of the man's neck, just below his ear. He bellowed, a sound of agony and shock, his grip on her slackening for a single, crucial instant. It was all she needed. She broke free, scrambling away as he clawed at the pin, his face contorted in pain. That instant was all Cole needed as well. With the man's body no longer shielding Lila, Cole fired the Colt. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The big man collapsed, his bellow cut short, and lay still. Now only Nathaniel remained. He stood in the shattered doorway, a pistol in his hand, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. His plan, so simple, so certain, had dissolved into a bloody shambles. He saw Cole, leaning heavily against the wall, blood pouring from the wound in his ribs, and a cruel, triumphant smile spread across his face. "It seems I will have to finish this myself after all," he said, raising his pistol. But Cole was already moving, fueled by a final, desperate surge of adrenaline. He launched himself away from the wall, not trying to shoot, but to close the distance. He crashed into Nathaniel, sending them both tumbling out of the doorway and into the dirt. Nathaniel's shot went wild, the bullet burying itself in the dirt. The fight was a brutal, close-quarter struggle. It was not a contest of skill, but of raw, primal will. Cole, weakened by his wound, fought with the ferocity of a dying wolf. Nathaniel, enraged and panicked, fought with the viciousness of a man whose world was crumbling. They rolled in the dust, trading blows, grunting, cursing. Cole's vision was swimming in red, the world a dizzying, pain-filled blur. He felt Nathaniel's thumbs pressing into his windpipe, the air being squeezed from his lungs. The blackness was closing in. He thought of Anna, the little girl with the corn-husked doll. He thought of his horse, a bloody sacrifice on the barn door. And he thought of Lila, of the child she carried, of the life they had been promised for a single, fleeting night. He would not fail again. With the last of his strength, he reached for the knife still tucked in his belt. He drove it upward. Once, twice. A desperate, final act of defiance. Nathaniel's body went rigid. The pressure on his throat released. A look of profound, ultimate surprise crossed his face. He stared down at the hilt of the knife protruding from his chest. Then his eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed on top of Cole. A dead weight. Cole lay there, pinned beneath the body of his enemy. The world fading to a dull, distant roar. He had done it. She was safe. He closed his eyes and let the darkness take him. Lila watched it all from the doorway, her mind numb with shock. She saw Nathaniel fall. She saw Cole go still beneath him. And she saw the last remaining enemy, Sheriff Brody, the lawman. Seeing his powerful patron dead, had turned his horse and was spurring it into a gallop, fleeing the scene, the only official witness escaping to tell whatever version of the story would save his own skin. Something inside Lila snapped. All the fear, all the grief, all the rage of the past weeks coalesced into a single point of cold, hard clarity. She would not let him. She would not let him escape and turn their desperate act of survival into a story of murder. She ran to where Cole lay, her feet stumbling in the blood-soaked dirt. She grabbed the heavy Colt from his unresisting fingers. She had never fired a gun in her life, but she did not hesitate. She raised the pistol with both hands, just as Cole had taught her in a brief lesson the day before. The sheriff was 100 feet away now, a receding figure of cowardice. She aimed not for the man, but for the horse, and pulled the trigger. The recoil jarred her arms, and the shot went wide. But she pulled the trigger again. This time, her aim was truer. The sheriff cried out, a high, thin sound of pain, and tumbled from his saddle, his leg twisting beneath him at an unnatural angle. He lay in the dust, clutching his shattered leg, his escape cut short. The silence that fell then was absolute, broken only by the whimpering of the wounded sheriff and the frantic pounding of Lila's own heart. The battle was over. It was the sound of the gunfire that had drawn them. They came slowly, hesitantly, from the direction of town. At first a few, then a dozen, then what seemed like the entire population of Redemption. They gathered at the edge of the clearing, a silent, murmuring crowd, their faces a mixture of fear, curiosity, and grim judgment. They saw the bodies littering the ground. They saw the wounded sheriff, the dead land baron, and the two outcasts at the center of it all. A bitter, accusatory silence fell over the onlookers. The social order, as they knew it, lay in ruins. The most powerful man in the valley was dead. The law was a wounded, whining coward on the ground. Everything they understood was upended. Their first instinct was to condemn, to side with the dead authority. Elias, the man who had taunted them in the street, was the first to speak. "It is murder," he spat, his voice ringing with self-righteous certainty. "Cole has murdered them all. And that woman, she is a witch." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. This was the easy story, the one that would restore order. But before the narrative could take root, another voice cut through the tension. "That is not what I saw." The voice was quiet, but it carried an undeniable authority. It belonged to Martha, a widow who lived on a small, hardscrabble farm at the edge of town. She was a woman of few words, respected for her quiet dignity and her tireless work ethic. She stepped forward from the crowd, her face pale but resolute. A few years back, her only son, a boy of 10, had fallen through the ice on the river in the dead of winter. The townsfolk had stood on the bank, helpless, unwilling to risk the treacherous ice. But Cole, who had been riding by, had not hesitated. He had tied a rope around his waist and crawled out onto the groaning ice, pulling her boy from the freezing water, saving his life when no one else would. The town had forgotten. Martha had not. She pointed a trembling finger at the dead men. I was in the hills, gathering firewood. I saw it all. Mr. Crown and his men, they came here with rifles drawn. Cole offered to face him one-on-one. A fair duel. Mr. Crown laughed at him. He ordered his men to storm the cabin, to take her by force. Her voice grew stronger, filled with a conviction that silenced the murmuring. They fired first. They shot Cole. I saw him go down. Everything he did, everything she did, it was to defend themselves. It was not murder, it was justice. A stunned silence followed her words. Then, another man, a blacksmith whose runaway horse Cole had once stopped from trampling a child, stepped forward and nodded. She is right. I saw it too. An old woman, whom Cole had shared his supplies with during a harsh winter, joined them, one by one, a small handful of the town's quiet, forgotten people, those who had been touched by a kindness Cole had shown when he thought no one was watching, stepped forward, their presence a silent rebuke to the judgment of the crowd. The social order of redemption cracked, the foundation of power, built on the wealth of men like Crown and the cowardice of men like Brody, crumbled in the face of a simple, undeniable truth spoken by the town's own outcasts. Justice, for once, was on the side of the disgraced. Elias and the others fell silent, their faces a mixture of confusion and bitter resentment. But Lila heard none of this. The moment the battle was over, her world had shrunk to the still form of the man lying in the dust. She ran to him, falling to her knees at his side. She pushed Nathaniel's heavy body off him, her hands searching for a pulse, for a breath, for any sign of life. "Cole," she sobbed, her tears falling onto his pale, blood-streaked face. "Oh, Cole, please, do not leave me. Please do not leave me alone." She saw the terrible wound in his side, the sheer amount of blood that soaked his shirt and the ground beneath him. He was dying, after everything they had survived, after the glimpse of a future she had dared to believe in. She was losing him. She pressed her face to his chest, her body racked with a grief so profound it felt as if it were tearing her apart. Then she felt a hand, weak and trembling, touch her hair. She looked up, her vision blurred by tears. His eyes were open, just barely. A faint, crooked smile touched his lips. He was broken, bleeding, hovering on the edge of death, but he was smiling at her. And in that smile, she saw the promise of a dawn that was yet to come. The world that returned to Cole did so in fragments, like pieces of a broken mirror reflecting a nightmare. For weeks, he drifted in a red-tinged sea of fever, tossed between the searing pain in his side and the icy grip of his own ghosts. He was back in Missouri, the air thick with the smoke of the Schmidt's burning farmhouse, the ghost of little Anna watching him with her wide, questioning eyes. He was pinned beneath Nathaniel Crown, the weight of the dead man suffocating him, the smell of blood and dust filling his senses. He would cry out, his voice a raw, broken thing, and a cool hand would touch his forehead. A soft voice would whisper his name, a lifeline pulling him back from the edge of the abyss. Lila became a creature of pure will. She did not sleep, she did not rest. She existed in a perpetual twilight of exhaustion. Her world shrunk to the small, bloody universe of Cole's wound. She cleaned it. She stitched it with unsteady hands and a prayer on her lips. She packed it with poultices of yarrow and comfrey that Martha, the widow, had shown her how to make. Martha had been the first, the day after the shootout. She had appeared at the edge of the clearing, not with questions, but with a basket containing bread, a slab of bacon, and the healing herbs. She had looked at the bullet-riddled, partially burned cabin, at the exhausted, blood-stained woman in the doorway, and had simply nodded, leaving the offering on a clean patch of ground. That single act of quiet defiance seemed to break a spell in the town of redemption. 2 days later, the blacksmith arrived with his wagon, not saying a word, and unloaded a stack of fresh-cut lumber. He was followed by others. Men who had once jeered at Cole now came, their faces grim and purposeful, and began the slow work of repairing the damage. They patched the roof where a stray shot had started a small fire. They replaced the splintered door and the shattered window frame. They worked in silence, a communal, unspoken penance for the years they had allowed the darkness of men like Crown to rule their valley. They were not rebuilding a cabin. They were rebuilding their own integrity. One plank, one nail at a time. Lila moved through it all like a ghost, her focus entirely on the man struggling for life on the cot. She would emerge from the cabin to find a fresh bucket of milk waiting for her, or a brace of rabbits, cleaned and dressed, hanging from a peg. She never knew who to thank, and no one waited for her gratitude. It was simply there, a testament to the profound shift that had occurred. The story had solidified, aided by a terrified Sheriff Brody who, with his leg in a splint and his authority in tatters, told a traveling magistrate the exact truth as he had seen it, a version that painted Cole not as a murderer, but as a man defending his home and the woman he was protecting. With Nathaniel Crown dead, his empire of fear and debt began to unravel, and the town, blinking in the sudden light, began to see the world as it truly was. Cole's fever broke on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the fight. He awoke to the sound of a hammer hitting a nail, a steady, rhythmic sound that was utterly out of place in his world of silence. He opened his eyes, and the first thing he saw was Lila, asleep in the chair beside him, her head slumped forward, her face pale and thin with exhaustion. The gray shawl he had worn was draped over her shoulders. The sight of her, so fragile and so fierce, was a physical ache in his chest, more potent than the dull throb in his side. He was alive, and she was still there. His recovery was slow and agonizing. At first, he could barely sit up, his body a stranger to him, weak and unresponsive. Lila fed him broth, her hand steady as she held the spoon to his lips. He watched her, marveling at the strength that emanated from her. She had faced down death, nursed him back from the brink, and was overseeing the rebirth of their home, all while the new life she carried grew within her. He saw the changes to the cabin, the new, sturdy door, the clean glass in the window that let in the bright autumn sunlight. He learned of the town's quiet assistance, and it sat uneasily with him. He did not know how to be the recipient of kindness. He had built his entire identity around being the outcast, the pariah, to be seen as something else, as a man worthy of help, of respect, was a disorienting, uncomfortable feeling. Not everyone had changed, of course. Elias and his ilk still held their hatred close, their faces sour and resentful as they saw the community rally around the man they had despised for so long. Their world, built on a simple hierarchy of might and money, had been upended, and they could not forgive him for it. But their voices, once the loudest in town, were now just bitter whispers on the wind. A month after the shootout, Cole was on his feet, unsteady but determined. Their supplies were low again, and the time had come to face the town. He saddled the sorrel mare, his movement slow and careful. He expected Lila to wait for him at the cabin, but she met him at the corral, her jaw set with a quiet determination. They would go together. The ride into redemption was different this time. The silence that met them was not one of hostility, but of a quiet, watchful curiosity. As they rode down the main street, people stopped what they were doing and stared, but the glares of contempt were gone, replaced by looks of awe, of respect, and in some cases, of a grudging admiration. They dismounted in front of the general store, the same spot where Elias had confronted them. This time, no one approached. Cole went inside, and Lila waited on the boardwalk. She did not stare at the ground. She did not try to make herself invisible. Her pregnancy was visible now, a gentle, unmistakable curve beneath her dress, a simple calico garment Martha had given her. She stood straight, her head held high, and met the gaze of anyone who looked her way. She was not Nathaniel Crown's runaway bride. She was not Cole's fallen woman. She was Lila, a survivor, a mother-to-be, the mistress of her own life. She had fought for this piece of ground, for this man, for this future, and she would not be ashamed. She saw Martha across the street, standing in the doorway of her small house. The widow smiled, a small, genuine smile of profound approval, and Lila smiled back. It was a benediction. Life settled into a new rhythm, one of peace and quiet purpose. The cabin was whole again, the scars of the battle fading into the grain of the new wood. Cole's strength returned, the wound in his side healing into a puckered, angry scar, another mark on a body that was a roadmap of a hard-lived life. They worked side by side, preparing for the coming winter, their movements synchronized, their silences comfortable, filled with the deep, unspoken understanding of two people who had been forged into one in the crucible of violence and fear. But as the outer world healed, Cole's inner turmoil grew. He was living a life he had never believed possible, a life he did not think he deserved. The ghosts of his past had been driven back by the battle, but they had not been vanquished. They waited in the shadows, whispering to him in the dead of night that this peace, this love, was a lie, a temporary reprieve before the world reclaimed him for the sinner he was. One night, as they sat before the fire, the weight of it all became too much. He had been staring into the flames for an hour, his face a mask of stone, when a single tear traced a path down his cheek. He did not seem to be aware of it. Lila, who had been mending one of his shirts, put down her sewing and came to him, kneeling on the hearthrug at his feet. She said nothing, simply laid her hand on his knee. His composure, so carefully maintained for so long, finally shattered. A low, ragged sob escaped him, the sound of a soul breaking. He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with a grief that came from a place deeper than any bullet wound. "I never thought," he choked out, the words raw and broken. "I never thought I would live long enough for anyone to... I do not deserve this, Lila. I do not deserve you." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a self-loathing that was terrifying to behold. "Everything I touch, I destroy. The Schmitz, my horse. I am a curse, a murderer in exile. Just like they said, and one day, you will see it too, and you will leave." The words were a poison he had been holding in for 10 long years, and now it was all pouring out. He confessed his deepest fear, not that he would be killed, but that he would be loved, and that he would inevitably fail that love, bringing ruin to the only good thing that had ever happened to him. Lila listened, her heart aching with a love so fierce it felt as if it might consume her. She did not try to quiet him. She let him pour out all the darkness, all the pain, all the self-hatred he had carried for so long. When he was finished, his sobs subsiding into shuddering breaths, she reached up and gently pulled his hands away from his face. She held his gaze, her own eyes clear and unwavering. "You are not a curse, Cole," she said, her voice soft but unshakable. "And you did not destroy anything. A cruel world did that. You were just the one left standing in the wreckage, bleeding and alone." She took his larger, calloused hands in her own, her touch a gentle anchor in his storm. "You were never broken," she whispered, leaning forward, her forehead resting against his. "You were just waiting, waiting for someone who would not run, waiting for someone who would see the man, and not the ghost. I am not leaving, ever." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and in her eyes, he did not see pity or judgment. He saw a love as fierce and as steadfast as the mountains themselves. And for the first time in his life, he dared to believe it. He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss not of passion or desperation, but of a profound, soul-deep gratitude, a final, quiet surrender to the love he had never thought he deserved. The final scene was quiet. A month later, the first snows had dusted the high peaks, and the air was sharp and cold with the promise of winter. The cabin was warm and bright, a bastion of light and life against the coming dark. But tonight, they were outside, wrapped in a thick buffalo robe, lying on a blanket beneath a canopy of stars so bright and clear they seemed close enough to touch. The sky was a vast, cold, and beautiful thing, a stark reminder of their smallness in the grand, indifferent sweep of the universe. But Lila's hand was in his, a small, warm point of contact that made the vastness of the sky seem less like a threat and more like a promise. From the deep woods on the ridge, a lone wolf howled, its voice a mournful, wild cry that echoed across the valley. It was the sound of the night, the sound of the untamed world, the sound of the threat that would always be there, just beyond the circle of their firelight. Cole felt Lila tense beside him, but he only squeezed her hand, a profound sense of peace settling over him. He was no longer running from the darkness. He had found his light. He whispered, his voice a soft rumble in the stillness. "Let it come. I have got what I was always fighting for." He turned his head and kissed her, a slow, gentle kiss that tasted of wood smoke and forever. As he did, he felt a faint, fluttering movement against his side, where her belly was pressed against him. The baby kicked, a tiny, insistent affirmation of the new life they had fought so hard to protect. The fire crackled, sending a shower of golden sparks up into the infinite. Starry dark, their love, forged in violence and fear, was now a quiet, steady flame, surviving, thriving, beneath the night's threat. Thank you for gathering around our campfire to hear this story. Please feel free to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow wanderers. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel to share your thoughts in English on this and other tales.